Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. Presiding Officer, I approach today's debate with a clear statement of fact at the outset. As the amendment states, the Scottish Government stands firmly behind the Equality Act 2010. I will also take this opportunity at the outset to say that we all have a duty and a responsibility with the language and the conduct that we will use today and indeed on all days. Public discussions on equality issues can be polarised and can sometimes include misconceptions. We should be mindful of the negative impact that polarised and sometimes inaccurate public discussion can have on the groups and the individuals impacted by what we will speak about today. As an example, Presiding Officer, in 2023, during a state visit to the UK, the United Nations appointed independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity commented that the abusive rhetoric by politicians, the media and social commentators has trickled down to create a culture of increasingly abusive hate speech against LGBT persons in the UK. The Scottish Government has always sought to debate this topic with sensitivity and compassion, based on evidence and the rule of law, and that's how ministers will respond today. And I would remind all members that there are ongoing judicial proceedings that relate to this debate, and it would not be appropriate for the Scottish Government to comment. The Scottish Government is committed to and fully upholds the Equality Act 2010. We have been clear in our support for the separate and single-sex exceptions in the Act, which can allow for people to be excluded when this is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. We recognise that it is the legislation for everyone, as it covers age, disability, gender assignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. It sets out the personal characteristics that are protected by the law and the behaviour that is unlawful. It protects individuals from unfair treatment and promotes a fair and a more equal society. Certainly.
Let's call Hamilton.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Does she recognise that the Equalities Act of 2010 came from a recognition that vast swathes of minorities in our communities were facing violations of their human rights, regular abuse, and it was actually a very necessary act that has actually functioned very well?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Alec Cole-Hamilton is quite right to point to the basis of that legislation and the reasons why it was brought in, and indeed the reasons why it remains just as important now as it was at its introduction. And I will repeat the message, Presiding Officer, that we have made before, that the Scottish Government strongly supports the separate and single-sex exemptions in that Equality Act 2010. Over the past few weeks, the Scottish Conservatives have asked multiple questions in this Parliament in relation to single-sex spaces. The Scottish Government has answered those questions in full, and at each time it has been raised, we have reminded them that the Equality Act 2010 is largely reserved, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission is responsible for its enforcement. It is the responsibility of all public bodies in Scotland to interpret and comply with the 2010 Equality Act. This is the law. We welcome the role of the Equality and Human Rights Commission in producing codes of practice and guidance for public bodies in Scotland to help them navigate their statutory obligations under the Equality Act 2010. This includes a guide for separate and single-sex service providers. The guidance also states that organisations might need to consider the impact of other legislation, such as the legal requirements for health and safety in the workplaces. There are some powers given under the 2010 Act given to Scottish ministers in areas such as the public sector duty regarding socio-economic inequalities, specific duties enabling the better performance of the public sector equality duty. But key provisions of the 2010 Act on matters such as discrimination and on the various protected characteristics such as, for example, sex and gender assignment are reserved. Presiding Officer, public sector bodies in Scotland are responding to their obligations under the Equality Act. NHS Scotland provides guidance through the Charter of Patients' Rights and Responsibilities. The Charter was last updated in 2022 and is required to be updated every 5 years, with the next scheduled update taking place in 2027. The Scottish Prison Service issued operational guidance in February 2024 to support implementation of the management of transgender people in custody policy. This was published in December 2023. This guidance is to ensure that the rights and the needs of the transgender people are protected, while also ensuring a safe and inclusive environment for everyone in the care of SBS and those who work there. Police Scotland is currently conducting a review of sex and gender with an aim to improve the terminology, recording practices and the use of sex and gender across the organisation. The review aims to achieve an outcome which is consistent with inclusivity, legal obligations and operational requirements, and respects individuals' rights and dignity. However, the Chief Constable is responsible for policing and is accountable to the Scottish Police Authority for this, not to Scottish ministers. The Equality and Human Rights Commission's Technical Guidance for Schools sets out clear advice and guidance on the provisions of the Equality Act as they apply to schools in relation to the provision of education and access to benefits, facilities or services, both educational and non-educational. It provides authoritative, comprehensive and technical guide to the detail of the law. The Supporting Transgender Young People in Schools Guidance for Schools provides non-statutory, legislative, policy and practical guidance for schools on the matters schools may wish to consider in responding to a young person's personal decision to consider or change their gender identity. This includes a range of considerations, including the provision of toilets and changing rooms, but goes well beyond these matters. The Behaviour in Schools Research 2023 identified concerns among school staff about increasing experiences of misogyny in schools. That is why in March last year the Scottish Government introduced new guidance for schools on preventing and responding to gender-based violence. The guidance provides clear advice for schools on challenging misogyny and responding to any incidents, which thankfully rare do arise. Presiding Officer, I recognise the points raised on single-sex spaces concern the safety of women. We remain absolutely committed to protecting and asserting the safety of women and girls in our society. Violence on women and girls is a fundamental violation of human rights and has no place in our vision for a safe, strong and a successful Scotland. To achieve our vision, we are implementing Equally Safe, Scotland's strategy for preventing and eradicating violence against women and girls.
Resume your seat a second. Point of order, Stephen Kerr.
A number of people have obviously tried to intervene, and I'm just seeking your clarification that it would be in order in a debate for the Cabinet Secretary to give way and allow a colleague to ask a question or seek a clarification. Mr
Kerr, you will know by now that is not a point of order and that it is entirely at the discretion of the person speaking whether or not they take an intervention. Cabinet Secretary, resume and I can give you a little bit of time back.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Delivery Equally Safe Fund supports the work of the Equally Safe strategy, which underpins Scotland's approach to preventing and eradicating violence against women and girls. It supports 119 projects from more than 100 organisations across every local authority in Scotland. Scotland is committed to meeting the benchmarks set by the international treaties and obligations such as the Istanbul Convention, which opposes violence against women and domestic violence. The debate on single-sex spaces can focus on frontline services that are crucial in providing support and safety for the survivors of violence against women and girls. The needs of survivors of rape and sexual assault must be the utmost priority of support services, and that is why we strongly support the exemptions in the Equality Act 2010 and are clear that access to separate or single-sex provision for survivors is a legitimate and proportionate response when providing support to rape survivors. Gender equality is at the heart of the Scottish Government's vision for a fairer Scotland. We want women and girls to be empowered to exercise equal rights and opportunities, have equitable access to economic resources and decision-making, and live their lives free of all the forms of violence, abuse and harassment. We continue to take forward work to protect, promote and improve gender equality, recognising intersectional inequality exists in Scotland. This includes working to deliver and implement the ambitious recommendations from the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, alongside the Women's Health Plan and Equally Safe. Gender inequality is complex and harmful, and it affects everyone, not just women and girls, and it affects us collectively as a country. Women are central to all government priorities, and ensuring the government is more gender competent is a core ambition of the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls, and something which the government strongly supports. Presiding Officer, our support for trans rights does not conflict with our continued strong commitment to uphold the rights and the protections that women and girls currently have under the 2010 Equality Act. The Scottish Government is committed to increasing equality and improving the lives of trans people in Scotland. Trans and non-binary people are a small, marginalised group. of 0.4% on Scotland's population, and they are often misunderstood, misrepresented and receive disproportionate levels of attention. And it is vital that we continue to work collaboratively to support each other. Presiding Officer, this is an important opportunity today to reiterate the Government's commitment to the Equality Act 2010 and welcome the role of the Equality and Human Rights Commission when it has to enforce the Equality Act and in providing codes of practice and guidance that supports all public bodies to comply with the law in Scotland. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I've tolerated a degree of reaction, but I would urge members and remind members that it is up to the member on their feet whether or not they take an intervention. Okay?